Hi, Daisy. Welcome to Potterwatch.
Hi, Holly. Thanks for having me.
Can you introduce yourself to the students, please?
Yeah. My name is Daisy Benson. I'm a librarian at the Howe Library, and my job is that I'm a liaison to several different departments, meaning I'm there to be a resource to people who are in majors that I work with. So, for example, I'm the liaison for history and gender and sexuality and women's studies, among others. But my other job is that I'm what's called the library instruction coordinator. And in that job, I do a bunch of things, but like most of my colleagues, I work with classes, and almost everyone in my department works with classes, particularly first-year classes. We work with a lot of TAP seminars, for example, and we help students to understand how to do research. And that's actually more complex than it might sound. It's not just about showing you how to find a book on the shelf or where to check it out, but it's about helping you figure out how to ask a question, how to figure out if a question is researchable, to refine that question into something that's meaningful. And we spend a lot of time working with students to ask questions, not to prove a point, but in order to explore something and learn from the evidence that is there, right? Which is often a shift from what students are taught in high school. So in first-year seminars in particular, we really focus on how do you begin to work with evidence and ask questions from that evidence to which you can come to an understanding of something new that is accurate. And we put a lot of stake into using materials that are reliable and that are produced through a process called peer review and or are known as scholarly publications. And these are materials that have gone through a process where experts in a field review them without knowing who wrote it and decide if that information is accurate and is contributing to the field. They review the way in which the work was done. And it's a very it's a really good practice for publication of materials rather than certain kinds of materials you may run into in your everyday life where anyone can put something forward and it's unmediated. It's a highly mediated process, and people are often asked as part of it to do revisions to make their work even better. So we put a lot of focus on that kind of material.
All right. So Daisy, you spent a lot of time thinking about questions. What is your question for us?
My question for us today is, what can we learn from the Harry Potter books about the idea of intellectual freedom? And intellectual freedom is something in my discipline that can be taken in a couple of different ways. In many libraries, intellectual freedom is highly related to the idea of book banning, which is something that, for example, happens more often in school and public libraries than in academic libraries, and happens when, for example, a parent would like for a book to be removed from a shelf because they feel that it is offensive for some reason, and it's offensive to the community and the values of the community, and asks that it be removed. And librarians believe really strongly that our job is not to hinder people's access to information, but to make that information available to them, no matter their age, no matter their perspective on things, so that people have good quality information. That doesn't mean that we buy things that are inaccurate, right? We are careful about making collection development decisions on that are things that are actually reliable. But there may be things in any library collection that you don't agree with. And we see that as a good thing. It's a way to challenge your thinking and grow rather than trying to avoid looking at things that you might not agree with immediately.
So where do you see the parallels in Harry Potter?
So I think there's several. One of the ways in which it intersects is the very obvious one that the Harry Potter books themselves, so this is sort of a meta thing, are one of the most banned books ever. They're routinely challenged in school and public libraries. just because people disagree with ideas about presenting witches as something that is positive, right? That it's an affront to people's religious beliefs. And librarians have a lot of resources at their fingertips to help them work through those things in their community. Our professional association is called the American Library Association, and they have an office called the Intellectual Freedom Office. And those people keep very close tabs on laws related to intellectual freedom and people's right to pursue information and read things that they want to read without being hindered by that. And those same people are the people who, for example, help us make sure that if you go into a public library and you need to be able to find information about breast cancer, that you can do that, right? That computer has not been set up with a filter that won't allow you to search for the word breast, right? There are many ways in which people who want to hinder one's intellectual freedom can do that, and it'll show up in a lot of ways. And so librarians are really strong on that and have always fought for the inclusion of books that are often asked to be banned, like the Harry Potter books, to remain on the shelves. And there are lots and lots of other books that many of you have probably read that have had intellectual freedom challenges put on them for a number of reasons. Huckleberry Finn has had numerous challenges to it. Alison Bechdel's book Fun Home had a lot of challenges on it. And there are different reasons that people do that. And part of our work as educators, if there are books that are challenging to us personally and we are using in a classroom, is to contextualize them and talk about them and look at them critically rather than leave them out of a collection wholly. One of the things that you see happening in Harry Potter in the libraries and information world there are some subtle and not so subtle ways of keeping information from Harry Potter and the students at Hogwarts. The library there has what they call the restricted section, right? And that can mean any number of things depending on how you look at it. It's a way of keeping books that might be controversial away from people, right? Or that you don't think someone's ready for away from them. Sometimes it might be construed as a way to keep something fragile away from people. But in Harry Potter, the restricted section really does seem to be a place to put things that they believe people might not be ready for yet, that they don't want the general public or the general students at Hogwarts to see. And that's a dangerous precedent to set, I think.
You mentioned fragile books. I was thinking about how many of these books we could assume are handwritten. We don't see the sort of publishing mechanisms of the wizarding world, but seeing that a lot of these are kind of like monk scribe era books, I could imagine some of them being quite fragile. But I think, you know, it certainly seemed to me as though that's not the main reason for putting them in a restricted area.
Yeah, in reading the books, I don't think that is the main reasoning there. But I think your comment is really well taken, that there are books, right? And we have some of them even at UVM that are really valuable, unique, handwritten manuscripts, right? And those materials are not going to just be, you know, sitting on the shelf at Howe Library for you to walk up to, and that's probably not surprising. But one of the things that librarians who work in rare books collections have really worked on in the last 20 years especially is trying to make themselves more accessible and visible to people so that people know that their goal isn't to keep you out of their collection. They need to safeguard the collection, right? And often those materials need special handling for temperature control and things like that so that they don't just crumble to pieces. But they do a lot of outreach now and work with a lot of classes. And at UVM, for example, there are classes on the history of the book that work really closely with our special collections librarians and look at and are able to sort of get those books out and experience using those books that they might not otherwise. And they want you to come to them and to use those books and not just have them locked up in a dark, hermetically sealed room all the time.
So in this series, we see at least 3 books that I think the text sort of tells us are evil in some way. We have Tom Riddle's diary, the whatever book it was that Tom Riddle found the Horcrux information in, and then this this potions book, which it's really the marginalia that makes it, potentially lethal to Draco, for example.
Yeah.
So what do you see the series as saying about all of this, knowing that Harry Potter itself has been a banned book and J.K. Rowling knew this as she was writing?
I think in many ways, what's interesting about it is it's fairly complex and challenging the way that it occurs in the book, because it's not cut and dried, right? There's no consistent line of this isn't here and this is, right? It is very complex, and I was thinking about that as I was reading, that it's hard to pin it down sometimes, where that's landing. So for example, the Horcrux book was removed from the shelves at the request of Dumbledore, correct?
I think so. Hermione can't find it. She
Right.
doesn't think this book is still there, but it was there when Tom was a student, I think.
Yeah, and there's a reference to it. There's it's known that it was there. And there are interesting things there happening, okay, is this just lost somewhere in the shelves in the sort of chaos of an archive, right? Which sometimes, archives will often have what librarians call hidden materials, and those are materials that have been acquired by an archive but that haven't been cataloged properly, so they're really hard to access, right? And the only person who might know where is that archivist, right? And archives are striving really hard to not have that kind of hidden collection, but that often will happen and has happened historically. So that's something Hermione might have been encountering with that particular work. But what seems to have happened is that Dumbledore removed it, right? And as a librarian, that's something that's very problematic, right? It's well, you're removing something that has intellectual value, clearly. But then if you step to another sort of persona, it's but what about the evil that's contained in it and the damage that can be done with that information, right? How do we reconcile that as we think about what information is available to us, right? And that's a really challenging thing. And I think oftentimes librarians take a lot of flack for speaking up for making things that people, including people with whom they agree about general worldviews, available, because once you start to say, this cannot be here, there are other things about which that will happen, right? And it becomes an ideological battle for your access to information, and that's really problematic, right? As a researcher, you want to be able to have access to whatever information you need, and sometimes that might be something that's construed as having an applied use, such as a manual of Horcruxes, right? The reason to remove it is, oh, you're going to go and, make a Horcrux, or, oh, this manual that tells you how to make a bomb, you're going to make a bomb. But other times there may just be an intellectual reason for needing to understand that thing and its role culturally, right? And librarians want to make sure that you have that way to do that, right? We get arguments about pornography in the same kind of way. Well, you shouldn't have anything that we might think is pornographic in a library. Well, lots of academics have written about pornography, right? So there are reasons to have different kinds of information there. And I think that because of the importance of the Horcruxes and the information contained in that book, really does challenge our sense of, but we want them to be able to find this because there's an answer in here. Yet, wait a minute, they're so dangerous. Dumbledore did the right thing, right? And you find yourself sort of in this play of like not being sure which is that right thing. And I'm not sure there is an easy answer to that. People from different disciplines will probably give you a different answer about should that book be available, right? Mm-hmm. A philosopher might give you a very different answer than a librarian would give you. But the librarian answer is it should be available. There is intellectual knowledge and it has contributed culturally to the wizarding world in a way that is quite profound, in fact, and that having it there would be of value.
And we see in Harry Potter that books that are deemed to be too evil, too problematic in some way, they don't just disappear. They often go to the room of requirements, because we see when Harry goes to hide the potions book that there's this like shadow library of hundreds or thousands of books that people have hidden there for whatever reason. So it's almost like we have like a 3-tiered library system. And this is one where Madame Pince has no authority.
Yeah, it's a completely secret library, right? And a private library in many ways, right? It's out of the scope of sort of any kind of other thing. And that's also really interesting. But again, like you have to have what's interesting about the room of requirement, right, is your entry is your requirement. So you're only going to get there if you have this very intense and immediate need for it, right? Not a general curiosity. Which is an interesting form of what in librarianship, it's an interesting twist on the idea of gatekeeping, which is an idea that we use sometimes in librarianship to think about shifting roles of the understanding of librarians' role as collector of intellectual information and also disseminator and making things accessible, right? And in the past, some librarians sort of thought of our role as being people who were the gatekeepers of knowledge, right? We collected things, we made the decision about it, we decided who got to have access to it. Oh yeah, you're ready for that now. But the professional opinion on that now is no, we should not be gatekeepers. We need to be making everything available to people so that they can access it without hindrance. Because we may not know what their need is and they may not be able to speak of that to us, for example. So yeah, it is a really interesting twist on that idea.
So we talked a little bit before we started about the sort of depiction of libraries in general, and librarians and users of libraries. So what can you say more about that? So
I find the depiction, like on the one hand, it's amazing and heartrending that libraries play a big role in Harry Potter, right? They're there, they go to the library, they use it, but at the same time, it's kind of problematic. There are a lot of stereotypes about libraries and about their use and the people who use them that Rowling falls into. So for example, the librarian at Hogwarts, Irma Pince, the word pince is most commonly in the English language used with, and I may pronounce this wrong, to describe a type of glasses called a pince-nez. So they're like a pair of glasses where you don't have any earpieces. You just have the over the nose part and probably a string. And so you put them on your nose and you look at things, and it's a very stereotypical librarian kind of wear, right? Like if you think about a stereotypical librarian, it would be a woman with gray hair and a pince-nez, and that would like scream librarian, right? And it's not a person who you see as champion to access information, but rather someone who might tell you to shush and to not spend time in the library and say, you're not ready for that, right? A shushing librarian, rather than being someone who wants you to be asking better questions and thinking about things and finding new ways to deal with the complexities of our current world. And I think that's where the libraries there let me down. They're not a place to go to open your world, or if it is, it's because you're subverting it and getting in on your own and getting to things by breaking the rules, rather than that the library is a proactively useful place and is helping you and advocating for you and your ability to do things.
All right, Daisy. Well, thank you so much for coming on Potterwatch and chatting about libraries with us.
Anytime.